This story is about my mom and all the women in my family. My mother never started a conversation in the beginning. It was always a continuation of some other conversation from that day, that week, that month, and I was supposed to keep up with her. She, for example, if she called me up, she'd say, the conversation would start with, "So I was talking to Bob," and I'm just looking at her. There's never a hello, who this is. It was like she had an endless conversation going on in her life. It was just continuing. So, for example, an answering machine to her, she would leave 5 or 6 messages in a row on an answering machine. Sometimes it'd simply be her laughing at the notion of a time limit. Now, I didn't have a communication breakdown with my mother. I did fine with her. It's other people that are the problem. For example, she often jumped to the wrong conclusion. She called my Aunt Barbara and said, "How you doing, Barbara?" And Barb said, "Not so good, Stella. Ginger died." And my mother went, "Oh my God." Now, naturally, Aunt Barbara was talking about her dog, Ginger, that would live 13 long years. My mother, for some reason, thought she was talking about our mutual cousin, David, who lives in Florida's wife, Ginger. So the conversation went like this. My mother went, "What happened?" "Well, she just didn't wake up one day." "Oh, that's so tragic." "Well, these things happen." "What?" "Well, she had a good life, Stella." "Barbara!" And so then my mother called all our relatives to say, "David's wife, Ginger, tragically died in her sleep." And frankly, I think Barbara's being a bit callous about it. She's 34 years old, for God's sake. Another example of my mother just not paying attention to how people react to things. I had a dog named Cinnamon, nicknamed Cinny, or Sin. My sister had a cat who was the most vicious creature I've ever seen in my life. It would lay in front of her house on its back and purr and invite people to pet it. People would reach down to pet it, and it would snap like a bear trap on their hands. They'd reach up, screaming, trying to shake it off their hand. My sister named the cat Lovable. Gives you an idea about my sister. We called it Love or Lovey. Both animals get out late. We lived on a hill overlooking the neighborhood. My mother went out to call for them. It's about 11 o'clock at night in the back porch. And she started yelling for them. She said, "Love, sin, love, sin." Lights are going on all over the neighborhood. My father runs down the stairs. My mother had no idea what it was about. He yanks her into the house. My father, typical, he's going, "For God's sake, they're going to think this is some hippie party." Which it cracks me up that my father would think that's what they say at a hippie party. Now, anybody here who's dating someone thinking of marrying them, this is my warning to you. My wife and daughter are here. They could say this. Look very closely at your intended parents, because it gives you an idea of the gene pool you're going to be spliced with. My wife never met my father, who was deceased, but she met my mother. My wife and I went out for a number of years. She thinks it was much longer than I do. There's a communication breakdown. It just seemed longer for her. But we went out for a number of years, and we would go out on triple dates with my mother. It would be me in the front seat with my mother sitting next to me, my future wife in the back seat. A great date for anyone. And this would be a typical conversation, my mother and I, while we're doing this. My mother goes, "So I was talking to, the guy." And I go, "What guy?" "The guy. And I said, "Well, which guy?" She goes, the guy. And I said, "You mean the guy with the trains?" She goes, "Yeah, the guy with the trains." And we're doing this back and forth. And I look in the rearview mirror, and my future wife is staring back and forth with growing alarm at how incoherent this conversation is. And she's back. It's like a tennis match directed by Alfred Hitchcock. So she's staring back, and she finally got mad and just blew up. And she goes, "For God's sake, Stella, you're talking about John Barnett. You've dated him for 3 years. Patrick, we've had dinner with him multiple times. Yes, he does like trains, but you both know his name. This is ridiculous." So I looked over to my mother, and my mother shrugged and smiled at me. And I said, "So what do you want?" And my mother went, "Who?" Now, my mother passed away, and whenever I see a blinking light in an answering machine, I think of her. Now, we have a daughter who's here tonight, and my wife is terrified that I've become my mother. So when my daughter was 4 years old, my wife was traveling for business, and I decided to take my daughter Sammy out on the town. My brother's a cook, and we were going to go to his fancy restaurant. I tell my wife this on the phone. My wife, who always repeats everything to me twice because she thinks I'm a fourth child in our household, says, "For God's sake, dress appropriately." It's a nice restaurant. I said, don't worry about it, we got it covered. So my daughter and I went out, we had a great time. She's 4. We had a great time, it was fun. We danced, ate and everything, and I made a fuss over it. The next day, my wife comes back, and she's a natural detective. She went through the laundry. She picks up this outfit. She goes, what is this? I said, no, she says, what outfit did you have Sammy wear last night? And I go, that fancy evening dress over there. My wife picks it up and goes, that's a nightgown, you idiot. I looked at my daughter. She shrugged at me and flashed me my mother's smile.